That morning the air on the outskirts of Florida felt heavier than usual. I can still remember the sound of a deep crack in the wood, like an old tree being forcibly broken. The ground shook beneath my feet, not because of the earthquake, but because something much bigger was struggling. "Someone is trapped?" shouted someone from the direction of the swamp. I ran without really knowing what I was going to see. I was only 13 years old at the time. My name is Ethan, and I live not far from a small conservation lot near our house. Usually the place is quiet, only the sound of birds and the friction of the wind in the weeds. But that day was different. There is a heavy sound like a restrained moan. When I got to the edge of the swamp, I saw him. An elephant. I know that sounds impossible. But in this part of Florida there really is a center for the conservation of exotic animals. A large shelter for animals rescued from illegal circuses and zoos. The elephant was named Mara, an African female who had been living there for almost 5 years. And now his huge body was plunged into a landslide pit near the edge of the swamp. The mud held half his body. The legs are immersed up to the thighs. Every time he tried to lift his body, the ground around him collapsed deeper. The sound of breathing is heavy. Long full of pressure. I saw 2 conservation rangers standing a few feet away. They did not dare to approach too far because the ground was unstable. One of them, Mr. Raymond, spoke over the radio in a restrained, panicked voice. "We need Derek's help. And veterinarians. Now." I stand sculpted. My chest feels tight. Mara is not just an animal in that conservation. He was like a symbol of the place, calm, intelligent, and oddly enough always seemed to understand the people who cared for him. But at that moment, his eyes did not look calm. His eyes were full of confusion and fear. The soil around the hole has actually been fragile for a long time. 2 weeks earlier it rained almost every day. The swamp overflows, and the usually dense edges turn into dangerous mushy mud. That morning, as Mara walked too close to drink, the ground beneath her collapsed. And now the weight of his own body became the biggest enemy. I don't know why my feet keep moving. Maybe it's because I'm too scared to keep quiet. Maybe it's because I can't just be a spectator. "Ethan, don't get too close." Raymond warned me. I stopped, but stayed within what I thought was a safe distance. I could clearly see how the mud was slowly closing the gap around Mara's feet. His every move made the ground beneath him even deeper. The sound of sirens was heard from a distance. Area rescue teams and veterinarians from the local wildlife conservation center are on their way. Time is running slow. Every 5 minutes feels like an hour. Mara began to stop struggling. Scares me even more. Because it doesn't mean he's giving up. It means he's exhausted. If he stops moving for too long, his blood circulation could be disrupted, muttered one of the guards. I didn't fully understand, but the tone of his voice was enough to let me know that this was serious. Rescuers arrived about 20 minutes later. A large tow truck stopped on still quite hard ground, about 30 meters from the site. Some people came down with helmets and life vests. They carried thick wooden planks, steel ropes, and other heavy equipment. A large man approached, introducing himself as the head of the technical team. He stared at the situation for a few seconds without speaking. His face was stiff. "The ground is not stable enough to pull it right away," he said finally. "If we force it, it can collapse deeper." They set to work building a wooden plank path to approach without sinking. Each step is first tested with a long metal stick. The ground at some point immediately collapsed. Mara made a low sound as one of the boards shifted. He's still conscious, and every little movement around him made him uneasy. In the midst of the chaos, I saw something that made me stop breathing for a moment. One of its hind legs is stuck deeper than the other. If left too long, the pressure of the mud can damage his muscle tissue. Veterinarians explain that the weight of an elephant can reach 5 tons. Pressure on one point can be fatal. They had a quick discussion. Mild sedation may be needed to reduce panic. But if the dosage is wrong and he loses power completely, he can collapse and make the situation worse. All options feel risky. I stood there, hands shaking, trying to make sense of what I saw. Suddenly I realized something. On the left side of the hole, there was a large half-embedded log. It's the remains of a tree that fell a few months ago. The position of the rod was parallel to Mara's body. I don't know why that thought came up. Maybe it's because I used to help Dad fix the fence on our little farm. Maybe it's because I watched too many videos about animal rescue techniques that I approached Raymond. If the log is used as a barrier, it may be able to prevent the soil from collapsing more in time to be pulled, I said slowly, almost hesitantly. He turned to me. Maybe he wanted to keep me away. But then he saw the direction I was pointing. He called the head of the technical team. They had a quick discussion. One member of the walking team carefully examined the log with the pressure test device. The wood is still solid. The roots stick deep enough on the more stable side. That could be an additional fulcrum, the man said finally. I don't know if your idea was really helpful, or just a coincidence. But a few minutes later they began to tie the main steel rope not only to the crane, but also wrapped it around it with an additional pulley system that took advantage of the log as a lateral support. The process is slow. Very slow. Mara was given light sedation. He is still conscious, but his movements are more controlled. His breathing sounded heavy, like an old engine that was working too hard. Everyone moves away when the crane starts operating. The sound of heavy machinery echoed in the damp air. The steel rope tensioned slowly. The ground around the hole shook. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then I saw the mud around his hind legs start to crack. "Stop!" shouted the head of the team. They stopped the attraction point. One of the support boards shifted. The ground almost collapsed again. They added an extra board. Strengthened the left side. Rearranged the pull angle. Time feels like it's frozen. The sun is getting high. The Florida heat is starting to sting the skin. Sweat mixed with mud on the faces of the rescuers. The second pull begins. This time more slowly. I could see Mara's muscles tensing. His body moved a few centimeters. Just a little. But enough to make me hold my breath. The ground collapsed a little, but the log I knocked over withstood some of the pressure. The pulley system works. Divided load. Go on slowly. The team leader's voice sounded like a whisper of prayer. Suddenly there was a loud suction sound from the mud, like a shoe pulled from a deep swamp. One of Mara's hind legs is missing. He made a loud noise, not panic, but like a final impulse. Everyone shouted instructions at once. Third attraction. His body rises higher. Mud splashed everywhere. I almost slipped while trying to stay on my feet. And then in one heavy and slow motion, the huge body finally came out of its trap. Mara collapsed to the harder side, panting but free, quiet. Only the sound of his breathing and the crane engine were turned off. I didn't realize I was crying until my mother, who somehow came to the scene, hugged me from behind. The vet immediately examined her legs. There is swelling but no fracture. Blood circulation slowly returns to normal. The recovery process takes weeks. I used to come after school to see how things were going. Sometimes just stand still behind the fence point. One afternoon, when she was able to walk slowly again, Mara stopped a few meters away from me. He lifted his head slowly, toward where I was standing. I knew maybe it was just a coincidence. But then it felt like a wordless confession. A few months later, the conservation center reinforced the entire edge of the swamp with a new drainage system and buttresses. They also install soil sensors to detect excess moisture. The people called the incident a successful rescue operation. Local media came to interview the team. My name was briefly referred to as the boy who gave simple ideas. But to be honest, I don't feel like a hero. I just stood in the right place at the wrong time, or maybe the most important time. What I remember most is not the cheers afterwards. All I remember are Mara's eyes when I first saw her that morning, full of confusion and fear, and how slowly the tension turns into relief. Sometimes people ask me if I'm not afraid to be that close to a panicked 5-ton elephant. I always answer honestly, of course I'm scared. But there are moments in life when fear must stand side by side with caring. And that morning in the Florida marshland that nearly swallowed an elephant alive, I learned that courage is not about not being afraid. Courage is staying. The weeks after the rescue felt like a long, heavy dream. School went normally, but my mind always went back to the swamp. Every rustle, every tremor in the ground, always made me turn my head, worried that Mara would be trapped again. I often think about how Mara felt back then. How could he, such a huge creature, be so vulnerable to something that seems trivial to humans? Landslides.my dad started taking me to conservation centers more often. At first, I just wanted to make sure Mara was okay. But slowly, I began to help the team in small things. Preparing feed, checking the condition of simple tools, even learning how to read the behavior of elephants so that they do not get stressed. Every interaction with him is like a lesson in patience and empathy. Mara is never in a hurry. It always moves in its own rhythm. I learned to follow the rhythm point one afternoon, when the sun began to lower and the golden light penetrated the trees around the conservation. Mara came closer to me herself. He stopped a few feet from the fence, looking at me with his trunk slightly raised, as if reminding me of the day of the rescue. I stood still, touching the wooden fence that separated us, and felt something strange, an inexplicable sense of connection. It felt like we were sharing the same experience, albeit in different languages. The tension of the day didn't just go away. I often woke up at night, imagining the mud holding Mara back, her heavy breathing, and the sound of the earth rattling around her. I realized that fear was not only about Mara's safety, but also about helplessness. I, little boy, can come up with a simple idea that helps rescue teams, but I can't really draw elephants myself. It feels like reminding yourself of the limits of human capabilities in the face of nature. Conservation teams also began to more seriously monitor the entire swamp area. They added anchoring boards at weak spots, installed a soil moisture sensor system, and built an emergency lane for quick handling if another animal gets stuck. I get involved, sometimes just watching, sometimes helping with wiring or observing equipment. It was like being at the forefront of a world that I usually only see through books or television. One day, I followed the vet to check the condition of Mara's legs. It runs slowly along the surveillance line. The veterinarian describes any changes in the skin, muscles, and joints. Elephants are very intelligent, he said. They remember the trauma. If we are not careful, this bad experience can scare everyone, even the nurse herself. I looked at Mara, who was silent and calm, but her eyes remained alert. I felt like he was measuring my every move, my every breath. Day after day, I see a change in myself. I'm more patient, more thorough, more sensitive to the tension around. I started writing a little journal about Mara's behavior, trying to make sense of every movement, every sound she made. I even learned a bit about elephants' nonverbal communication, how their trunks, ears, and tails can give clues about their emotions. One experience I will never forget was when Mara first tried to walk in the shallow swamp after the rescue. The ground was still soft, and I stood on the safer side, watching her every step. Suddenly one of his legs slipped and his body almost fell. I stalled, trembling, holding my breath. But then he balanced himself and I realized something he learned from that trauma. He was careful but not afraid. I smiled, moved to tears. The lessons of resilience are so real, so profound. Seasons change. Florida experiences heavy rains, minor storms, and days of intense heat. But Mara stayed strong and I stayed here, always watching her. Every time I come back from school, I see him walking in conservation areas, sometimes interacting with other elephants, sometimes just sitting under shady trees, enjoying the tranquility. I learned that the rescue wasn't just about the physical, it wasn't just about pulling a big body out of the mud, but about taking care of it mentally and emotionally. There was one moment that changed me the most. I was sitting on a wooden bench, recording Mara's behavior in my journal when she approached, pressed her trunk slowly to my shoulder. I was surprised. His body was big, but his movements were so soft. I could feel his warm breath, his strong but calm heartbeat. At that moment I realized all the fears, all the worries, all the restless nights, all of them brought me to this point, to a connection that cannot be measured in words. the experience also made me more aware of man's responsibility to nature. I often reflect on how elephants, such big and powerful creatures, can be so fragile in human hands, even because of small things like landslides or lack of conservation management. I want to be part of the change, not just the audience. When I tell this story to friends at school or to my family, I always start with that tense scene. The crumbling ground, Mara's heavy breathing, the roar of the crane, and how everything can go wrong in an instant. But I also always end with something more important. A lesson I learned about empathy, courage, and interspecies connection. Now, a few years later, I still visit Mara a lot. It's already big, strong, and quieter. But I know that experience, the day he was trapped, will never go away. It remained in his eyes, in my memory, and in my every step. As I looked at the world around, I realized that the tension didn't just go away after the elephant came out of the mud. The tension remained but changed shape. From fear to vigilance, from helplessness to action, from trauma to life lessons. And I know even though I was just a little boy back then, I learned more from Mara than any book or teacher could teach. About patience, about courage, about understanding other beings without the need for words. About how one small action like pointing at the right log could save a big life. Every time I close my eyes and imagine that day, I can still feel the landslide, the smell of wet mud, the sound of Mara's heavy breathing, and my own almost inaudible heartbeat. Feels real. Too real. And I believe anyone who has ever witnessed something big and fragile will understand that courage often appears in the most unexpected places and times. Over time, I began to write more about this experience. About animal rescue, about conservation, about tensions that turn into life lessons. And I hope whoever reads this story can feel a little bit of that tension, a little bit of that fear, and most importantly, a little bit of the hope and courage that comes from it. Because Mara, that big elephant, wasn't the only creature that survived the mud. He was a teacher, a reminder, and a friend in the most unexpected forms. And I, the local boy from Florida, knew that the experience would make an impression on me for the rest of my life, like the giant footprints left in the mud that morning. After Mara got out of the mud, life in the conservation did not immediately return to normal. There is a sense of relief, of course, but also tension remains. Whenever it rained heavily, I couldn't help running to the window, staring at the swamp, hoping Mara would stay safe. Even the sound of the ground shifting just a little bit already made my chest thump. I learned that fear isn't just a momentary reaction. It's part of a constant state of alertness. The first days after the rescue, Mara looked confused. His body trembled, his legs were sometimes unstable, and he looked at each guard carefully. I often sat on the side of the fence, noting his behavior, trying to understand what he was feeling. I learned to read elephant expressions in a way I never imagined. How the ears move, how the proboscis trembles, how the eyes can radiate fear. Even pain. One afternoon, I saw Mara approaching slowly. He stopped a few feet from me, lowered his head, and stuck his trunk in the fence. It was like a simple statement. I'm still here. I'm safe now. But I remember. I shed tears, felt such a strong closeness, although we spoke different languages. It's not simply a human-animal interaction. It's a connection born of trauma and mutual healing. The conservation team began strengthening the entire swamp area with an earth retaining system and additional safety boards. I helped out, sometimes just observing, sometimes putting up wires or wooden planks. Every action feels important. Every step taken by Mara is now closely monitored, so that there is no gap for a second disaster. I learned that rescue is not just about the physical, but about planning, vigilance, and risk control. A few weeks later, Mara began to walk further in the conservation area. I stood on the safe side, watching her every step. The body is large, but the movements are gentle and careful. I could almost feel the tension in his muscles, and when one of his legs slipped on the still soft ground, my breath caught. But he balanced himself, was careful, and continued on his way. I smiled, shed tears again. The lessons of resilience, courage, and patience were so real before my eyes. Those days, I also started writing a journal about Mara. I recorded his behavior, movements, interactions, even emotional reactions. I learned little by little about the psychology of elephants, how trauma can affect them, how bad experiences can leave a mark on their memory. Veterinarians often emphasize that elephants can be very sensitive to the environment and humans. They remember the trauma, and if left unchecked, can become fearful of the humans who are supposed to care for them. That I also learned more about myself. I realized that I had changed since that day of salvation. I'm more patient, more thorough, more sensitive to the tension around. I learned that courage is not about not being afraid, but about staying in the right place, the right time for what matters. I learned that one small act, like pointing at the right stick of wood, can make a big difference. On certain nights, I still wake up imagining the mud holding Mara, her heavy breathing, the sound of the ground cracking. The tension did not go away, but I also began to understand that the tension was changing shape. From fear to vigilance, from helplessness to action, from trauma to life lessons. One day, as I was sitting journaling on a wooden bench, Mara approached. He stopped a few feet from the fence, looked at me with calm but watchful eyes, then pressed his trunk slowly to my shoulder. I felt his warm breath, his strong but controlled heartbeat. It was then that I realized all the fear, all the restless nights, all the worries about his safety, all of that brought me to this point, to a connection that cannot be described in words. I also began to understand man's responsibility to nature. I often think about how an elephant, a large and powerful creature, can be so vulnerable simply because of seemingly trivial environmental factors, landslides, torrential rains, or lack of support systems in conservation. I feel called to be part of the solution, not just a spectator. Over time, I began to write more and more about these experiences, about animal rescue, about conservation, about the tensions that turned into life lessons. I hope anyone reading this story can feel a little of that tension, a little of that fear, and most importantly, a little of the hope and courage that comes from it. A few months later, Mara was already strong enough to interact with other elephants at the conservation. I watched them play, walk together, and learn from their experiences. Mara, who was once trapped and traumatized, is now showing signs of happiness. He was alert but not afraid. He learned from that experience just like me. I realized that the rescue was not only to save the big body from the mud, but also to save the soul and mentality. And I learned that true courage often comes at the most unexpected moment, when fear and concern go hand in hand. Now, a few years later, I still visit Mara a lot. I'm still recording his behavior, still learning from his every move, still feeling that strong bond. Mara is not the only elephant who survived the mud. He is a teacher, a friend, and a symbol of what can happen when people dare to care. And I, the local boy from Florida, knew that the experience would always make an impression, like the giant footprints in the mud that still remained that morning. A reminder that courage, empathy, and connection can emerge from even the most precarious situations. The days that followed after that rescue formed a big part of my life. I was still a kid, but I started to feel a pressure that I didn't understand before. Every time it rained heavily, I heard the sound of drops bouncing on the roof of the house, and my chest pounded. The memory of the mud holding Mara appeared very clearly, as if I was trapped myself. I began to have nightmares about the elephant, about the crumbling ground, about the heavy breathing screaming in the swamp. I talked a little bit about the dream to Dad. He just hugged me and said, "Ethan, you're going through something big. Not many kids your age can see and help save a creature as powerful as Mara. Don't be afraid of your fear." His words were soothing, but they didn't completely remove the anxiety. I learned that courage and trauma often go hand in hand, like two inseparable sides of a coin. Mara began to adapt. His body was slowly recovering, but his psychological trauma was still apparent. It stares at each human carefully, moves slowly near the machine, and sometimes even refuses to approach the area that used to be its trap. I realized that elephants remember bad experiences, not just instinctively but emotionally. The vet and conservation team explained this to me. Elephants can store memories of trauma for a lifetime. It is important to give him time and space. I learned how to respect that distance, wait for Mara to come closer rather than force her. I spent hours on that side of the fence, just keeping a journal, recording his movements, and learning to interpret every little sign. Ear movement, proboscis vibration, tail position. One afternoon, Mara approached herself. His trunk touched the fence slowly, then raised slightly towards me. It wasn't just a physical gesture, it was recognition. From that day on, I felt closer to him. I learned one big lesson. Healing trauma isn't always physically visible. Sometimes it comes in the form of a trust that builds slowly. Over time, conservation centers built emergency pathways for cases like Mara. Ground sensors were installed, safety boards were strengthened, and animal evacuation procedures were updated. I get involved, sometimes just holding tools, sometimes watching a team of professionals work. I learned that rescue is not only a heroic act at a crucial moment, but also a long-term planning. Real courage comes from preparation, not just spontaneity. But the tension doesn't stop there. A few months after the incident, there was a fairly severe local storm. It rained heavily, part of the conservation area was flooded, and some points of the swamp began to slide back. I stood on the edge, staring at Mara and the other elephants who were starting to panic. Conservation teams worked quickly, setting up safe pathways and moving the animals to higher ground. But I felt my heart rate rise, old memories of the mud holding Mara flooding my mind. Every step is stressful. I learned to hold my breath, count every second, wait for Mara to move carefully. I realized that past traumas can resurface, not only in animals but also in humans. The tension is not just a memory, but an experience that affects real actions. When Mara was finally safe in the high zone, I felt an inexpressible relief. I sat on a wooden bench, staring at the elephant moving slowly, adjusting to the new environment. I learned that salvation is not the end of tension. It is the beginning of vigilance, understanding, and responsibility. Several years passed. I started visiting Mara regularly. I recorded her behavior, observed her social interactions with other elephants, and learned more about animal psychology. Mara is now more confident, interacting with her friends, playing, and showing signs of happiness. But I still respect his boundaries. The trauma doesn't just go away. It learns to adjust to a safe environment. I also learned a lot about myself. I became more patient, more thorough, and more sensitive to the tension around me. I realized that the experience shaped who I was. A local boy from Florida who had been in a precarious moment that taught him courage, empathy, and responsibility. I learned that small actions, pointing at logs, journaling, observing closely, can have a huge impact on the lives of other creatures. Every time I sit on a wooden bench and watch Mara walk along a conservation trail, I remember the day she was trapped. I could still feel the landslide, the mud holding his feet, his heavy breathing that was about to break. I can still hear the crackling of the ground and the roar of the crane. It all lingers in memory, reminding me that true courage arises not from the inability to be afraid, but from the ability to act in the midst of that fear. Mara is now a symbol of conservation at the center. The conservation team used it as an example for public education, about environmental risks, the importance of evacuation planning, and the emotional connection between humans and animals. I was involved in several educational sessions, telling rescue stories and how one small act could save lives. Children who hear my stories often look at me with their eyes wide open. I know they feel the same tension I once felt, a fear that turns into lesson and courage. In the end, I realized that Mara's story wasn't just about an elephant that survived the mud. It was about the human-animal relationship, about responsibility, and about the courage that arises in the most precarious situations. I, the local boy from Florida, learned more from Mara than any book or teacher could teach. I learned about empathy, patience, courage, and tension turning into strength. And every time I close my eyes and imagine that morning, I can still feel the landslide, Mara's heavy breathing, and my own almost inaudible heartbeat. I know that experience will always remain, like the giant footprints left in the mud that morning, A reminder that courage, empathy, and connection can emerge from even the most precarious situations. Mara remains my teacher. And I know, even though I grew up, that fear, tension, and sense of responsibility will always be with me. As part of who I am, as part of the experiences that shaped me since I was a boy. Many years have passed since that morning when the mud almost swallowed Mara. I'm an adult now, a young man back in Florida, back in conservation who used to witness the most defining moment of my life. As I stepped on the familiar dirt track, the scent of wet earth and swamp grass brought back memories that never went away. Every step on that path was like stepping back in time to my childhood, a time when I learned the meaning of courage, responsibility, and empathy through such profound experiences. Mara is now older, bigger, but her pace remains calm. He is no longer afraid as before, although sometimes his big eyes still look at the surrounding environment with caution. I could feel his maturity not only physically but also emotionally. Her past experiences shape her. She learns from trauma, adapts, and finds confidence back in people. I walked slowly closer. He looked at me for a moment, his trunk slightly raised as if to say, "You're back." I smiled, shedding tears involuntarily. It was like going back to an old friend who had shared the same life experience. Over the years, I wrote notes, journals, and even essays about the rescue, about the trauma, and about the relationships that form between humans and animals. But writing is never enough to express all the tension, fear, and relief that comes with the day. I learned that these experiences imprint not only in my visual or emotional memory, but also in the actions and decisions I take each day. I remember the nights after that rescue, when I woke up many times, imagining Mara trapped again. I learned that trauma can show up even years later. I often woke myself up from nightmares about the mud holding his body, his gasping for breath, and the sound of the ground cracking. But I also learned to channel that tension into alertness, into mindfulness, into real responsibility. Now I see Mara interacting with other elephants. He is no longer a fearful creature, but a mentor to those who are younger. I watch them play, learn, and find balance in the swamp. Mara remains alert, but not bound by trauma. I smiled, realizing that he taught us all something invaluable. How to rise from a traumatic experience, how to rebuild trust, how to find calm after extreme tension. I walked to the wooden bench where I used to sit a lot, noted Mara's behavior, observed her social interactions, and wrote reflections. I write about how those experiences shaped me, how courage emerges from fear, and how empathy can be formed in precarious situations. I wrote about how one small act, pointing at a log, could change the fate of a great creature. As I wrote, I realized that the whole experience shaped the way I looked at life. I learned to appreciate the small details, respect life, and understand that tension, fear, and trauma are all part of the growth process. Not just in humans, but also in the animals we care for. I sat there for hours, watching Mara walk along the conservation path, occasionally offending the fence with her trunk, interacting with her friends. I felt as if time stopped, as if all the tension of the past had now become a living lesson. I learned that courage is not about not being afraid, but about staying on the right side in the right moment for what matters. That morning, I realized something important. The tension I felt from that day on never went away, but it changed shape. It becomes alertness, empathy, and attention. He became part of who I am. I'm no longer afraid of that tension. I'm learning to use it as a guide, as a reminder of what's important. Mara looked at me several times throughout the day, her trunk moving slowly, adjusting to my movements. I looked back at him, feeling such a strong bond which needed no words. It is the language of experience, the language of trauma healed, the language of trust built through time and patience. From that moment on, I always realized that Mara's story was not just about an elephant that survived the mud. It was about the human-animal relationship, about responsibility, about courage born of extreme tension. It was about how one small act could save a life and change a person's perspective forever. A local boy from Florida who is now an adult learned more from Mara than any book or teacher could teach. I learned about empathy, patience, courage, and how to deal with the tension in life with my head held high. I learned that the most stressful experiences can be life's most valuable lessons, if we're willing to learn from them. And when I closed my eyes that night, I could still feel the landslide, the mud holding Mara, her heavy breathing that was about to break, and my own heartbeat following her rhythm. But now I'm not afraid. I felt that tension, but I knew how to turn it into courage, care, and love. Mara remains my teacher. And I know, even as I grow up, that experience will always make an impression, like the giant footprints left in the mud that morning. A reminder that courage, empathy, and connection can emerge from even the most precarious of situations. I stood, watching Mara step towards the setting sun, her steps steady, calm, and full of life. I know whatever happens, the world is a little better because we've both been there, in the mud, in the tension, and in the invaluable lessons of life. And I smiled, realizing that this story is not just a story about salvation. It's a story about life, about learning from trauma, and about how one crucial moment can shape a person forever. I learned that courage, empathy, and caring aren't abstract things. They're real, they're felt, and they're present in every heartbeat that matters. A few years later, I returned to Florida as a grown man. I came back not just as a visitor, but as someone who wanted to make a real contribution to the conservation that used to be such an important part of my life. The dirt road I used to trot on as a kid now feels different, sturdier, safer, but the smell of wet mud and swamp grass remains the same, as if attaching the past to my every step. Mara is now older, her body is bigger, but her eyes are still full of intelligence and curiosity. He walks in a calm rhythm but alert. I looked at him, and instantly the memory of his day of salvation flooded back. The mudslide, the mud holding his body, his heavy breathing, and the stifled panic. I could still feel that tension, but this time I was no longer a helpless boy. I am someone who knows the meaning of responsibility, patience, and true courage. Ever since I was an adult, I started writing books about this experience. Not just the story of Mara's rescue, but also a reflection on trauma, empathy, courage, and the human-animal relationship. I wrote about how one small act, pointing the right stick of wood, could save lives. I wrote about how the tension I felt as a child remained, but now I can transform it into attention and action. Mara is now a conservation education center. Children came from the surrounding schools, carrying eyes full of admiration, heard my story about that day. I told her how Mara was trapped, how the rescue team worked, and how one small idea could make a big difference. They looked at me with their eyes wide open, and I looked back at a young version of myself, frightened but eager to help. As I stood next to Mara, I realized something important. Trauma is not the end of the story, but the beginning of learning. Mara taught me that true courage comes when we face fear, not avoid it. I also learned that empathy is not just a feeling, but a real action. Giving the animal room to heal, learning to wait, and respecting its limits. In conservation, Mara is now a mentor to young elephants. It teaches them social behavior, how to interact, and how to navigate a swampy environment that can be dangerous. I watched them play, learn, and find balance. Mara remained alert, but she had found calm. I smiled, realizing that stressful past experiences are now life lessons for many creatures, humans and animals alike, that I often think about how that experience shaped me. I realized that courage, empathy, and caring are not abstract things. They're real. They are felt. And they arise when we are at a crucial moment, when fear and concern go side by side. That experience made me more patient, more conscientious, and more sensitive to the tension around. I learned to assess risk, appreciate life, and understand that small actions can have big consequences. One evening, I sat on a wooden bench on the side of conservation, writing notes. The remaining sunlight reflected off the marsh water, creating a slowly moving shadow. Mara stood a few meters away from me, silent, looking towards the horizon. At that moment, I felt a deep calm. I know that all the tensions, fears, and traumas of the past have not gone away. They have become part of me, guiding me to become more responsible and aware of the life around me. I write about how this world can be a better place when humans care, when we dare to face our fears, and when we value relationships with other beings. I write about the importance of conservation, not just for large animals like Mara, but also for all species that depend on a safe environment. Mara looked at me several times throughout the night, her trunk moving slowly as if conveying a wordless message. You understand. I looked back at him, feeling an inexplicable bond. It is the language of experience, the language of trauma healed, the language of trust built through time and patience. I realized that Mara's rescue was not just a dramatic event in my childhood. It was a turning point that shaped who I am today. I learned that true courage is not about not being afraid, but about staying on the right side, in the right moment for what matters. I learned that empathy is not just a feeling, but a consistent and real action. A few years later, I finished a book about this experience. I told her everything: the tension, the fear, the courage, and the connection that arises between man and animal. I hope readers can feel a little of that experience, feel the tension that arises when one life is threatened, and feel the hope that grows when courage arises. Mara remains my teacher, even though I am now an adult. I still learn from him every time I come to conservation. I still feel the tension, but now I know how to turn it into courage, care, and love. Mara's every step in the swamp, every movement of the trunk, every social interaction she had with other elephants were real-life lessons. And when I close my eyes at night, I can still feel the landslide, the mud holding Mara back, her heavy breathing that is almost breaking, and my own heartbeat that follows her rhythm. But now I'm not afraid. I felt that tension, but I knew how to turn it into real courage, care, and love. I stood, watching Mara step towards the setting sun. The pace is steady, full of life and calm. I smiled, realizing that this experience was not just a story of rescue, but a story of life that shaped who I am, of courage, empathy, and connection that emerges from even the most precarious situations. I learned that trauma doesn't just disappear. But trauma can teach us to care more, to dare more, and to appreciate every creature around us. Mara remains alive, free, and safe. I kept learning, kept writing, and kept feeling the tension turning into life force. And I know one day the children who hear my story will learn the same thing. That true courage springs from tension, empathy is born from attention, and that real connection can emerge even in the most crucial of times. Mara is the proof of his life. And me? I was a lucky witness, student, and friend to learn from such a large creature. I stood on the edge of the swamp as the sun began to set, a golden-orange color bouncing on the surface of the water. Mara, now aged, walked slowly along the path I had known since childhood. His body is large, legs are firm, but his steps are more careful, as if counting every trace he leaves. I looked at him, feeling a sense of awe that never faded, mixed with a sense of responsibility that remained attached to my chest. Ever since I came back to Florida as an adult, my life has changed. I wrote a book about Mara's rescue experience, but writing wasn't enough. I want to make a real contribution to conservation, making sure no other elephant faces the same danger. I started working with the conservation team, designing better surveillance systems, emergency pathways, and education for the surrounding communities. I learned that courage comes not only in times of emergency, but also in the consistency of daily actions. Mara stopped a few meters from me. The trunk moved slowly, touching the ground, then slowly towards me. I smiled, shed tears again. It was then that I realized, what had been a stressful experience had now turned into a lasting bond. The trauma that Mara and myself have experienced has been a bridge to understanding and trust. I learned that the human-animal relationship can teach us things that no book or teacher has ever taught us: patience, empathy, and courage. These days I spend hours observing Mara and other young elephants. Mara is now a mentor to them, teaching them social behavior, interaction, and how to navigate the swampy environment that can be dangerous. I wrote notes, noted his movements, observed every expression. I learned to read elephants' body language, ear movements, trunk vibrations, tail positions, as a way to understand their emotions. One afternoon, Mara looked at a young elephant playing in the swamp. It pats the ground with its trunk, giving a signal of protection. I stared at the interaction in awe. The trauma that used to hold him back has now turned into a lesson for a new generation. I learned that bitter experiences are not the end of life, but can be the beginning of learning and growth. The nights in conservation are often silent. I sat on a wooden bench, journaling, reflecting on my life's journey since that morning when I was a boy. I wrote about the tension I felt when I saw Mara trapped, about the fear that almost made me helpless, about the little idea that helped her out of the mud. I write about how trauma remains, but can be transformed into strength, empathy, and caring. That I reflect on human life and our relationship with nature. I learned that true courage comes from tension, not from ignorance of fear. I learned that empathy comes from consistent attention, not just momentary feelings. And I realized that traumatic experiences, both in humans and animals, can be an invaluable source of life lessons if we are willing to learn from them. One morning, I observed Mara walking along a conservation trail, her trunk moving slowly, touching the ground, occasionally interacting with young elephants. I realized that a once stressful experience had shaped him into a wise, alert, and caring being. I also realized that the experience shaped me into a human being who is more aware of our responsibility and role in this world. Mara stopped at the side of the swamp, looking at me with calm but meaningful eyes. At that moment, I felt like I understood something bigger than myself. I learned that courage and empathy are not abstract things. They are real, felt, and appear in everyday actions. That stressful experience has formed a lasting bond between me and Mara, a bond that requires no words, but is full of understanding and trust. Past tensions, fears, and trauma never go away completely, but I learned to channel it into attention, action, and love. I'm writing about all of that, hoping that the next generation can learn from Mara's experience and from her story of salvation. I wish they could understand that every creature, no matter how small or how big, deserves protection, empathy, and attention. One day, I saw Mara aging more clearly. His skin began to show streaks of age, his pace was slower, but his eyes remained intelligent. I stood beside him, feeling a deep sense of respect and awe. I realized that life is about dealing with tension, learning from trauma, and continuing to care for those we love, both humans and animals. That I wrote in my last journal that night. This experience taught me that true courage is not about not being afraid, but about staying on the right side, in the right moment. Empathy is not just a feeling, but a consistent real action. Trauma is not always devastating. It can be a teacher that guides us to become wiser. Mara looked at me once more before stepping slowly into the forest. I smiled, feeling a peace I had never felt before. All the tension, all the fear, all the trauma I've felt since that day has formed something lasting. A relationship that neither time nor distance can destroy. I realized that Mara's story is not just a story about salvation. It was a story about life, courage, empathy, and responsibility. It was a story about how one crucial moment can shape a person forever. It was a story about me, a local boy from Florida, and an elephant that taught me the true meaning of life. When I closed my eyes that night, I could still feel the landslide, the mud holding Mara, her heavy breathing, and my own heartbeat. But now I know. The experience is no longer a source of fear. It is a source of strength, reminder, and inspiration to continue living with courage, empathy, and love. Mara remained alive, safe, and wise. I keep learning from him. And I know as long as I exist, this story, a story of rescue, suspense, and courage, will live on, inspiring those who come after me to appreciate life, face fear, and find courage at the most crucial moment. A few years later, I found myself back at the Conservancy, now as a young manager responsible for the sustainability of the place. Mara, who used to be a huge creature that was almost caught in the mud, now walked slowly along the path that I had known since childhood. His body was aging, his skin was thinning in some parts, and his pace was slower, but his eyes remained intelligent, full of awareness and attention. Every time he looked at me, I felt a bond stronger than just man and animal, a bond born of such deep shared experiences. I sat on an old wooden bench that used to be my place to record Mara's behavior. The light of the afternoon sun reflected off the marsh water, creating a slowly moving shadow. I watched Mara interact with the young elephant that now lives in conservation. He seemed like a true mentor, teaching them how to navigate the swampy environment that can be dangerous, how to interact with each other, and how to maintain balance in the wild. I smile, realizing that the trauma that once held him back has now turned into a life lesson, not only for the young elephant, but also for me and the conservation team. For years, I wrote journals and books about the experience. I wrote about the tension I felt as a little boy, about the mud holding Mara back, about her heavy breathing, and the sound of the ground cracking around her. I wrote about how one simple idea, pointing the right stick of wood, can save lives. I write about how trauma isn't always devastating, but it can guide us to be more empathetic, thoughtful, and attentive to other beings. Mara looked at me, her trunk moving slowly, touching the ground before towards her. I smiled and shed tears, feeling such a deep relief. Our relationship is no longer just a rescue, but an eternal connection. The traumas and tensions that used to bind us have now turned into genuine understanding and trust. I learned that true courage is not about not being afraid, but staying on the right side at the right time for what matters. I learned that empathy is not just a feeling, but a real, consistent, ongoing action. In recent months, I've led several new conservation projects, including educational programs for local communities and schools. I tell Mara's story, explain how the rescue happened, and how the experience teaches us about courage, responsibility, and empathy. The children looked at me with amazed eyes, and I saw a young version of myself, frightened but eager to help. I realized that experience is now an inspiration to the next generation. One night, as the moon reflected off the surface of the swamp, I sat on a wooden bench writing a long reflection in my journal. I write about how the tension of the past remains, but has turned into attention and action. I wrote about how Mara, despite her age, remains a teacher and mentor to all creatures in conservation. I write about how that experience shaped me into a human being more aware of responsibility, empathy, and true courage. Mara stood on the side of the swamp, staring towards the horizon. I approached slowly, feeling his steady pace despite his aging body. I realized that life is a series of critical moments that teach us more than books or formal lessons. Trauma and tension are not the end, but the starting point for learning, growing, and caring for those we love. I learned that human-animal relationships can teach invaluable life lessons: patience, empathy, and courage born of real experience. Day after day, I realized that Mara was not the only elephant who survived the mud. It is a symbol of life, courage, and endurance. He taught me about how to deal with tension with my head held high, how to rebuild trust after trauma, and how to take charge of other lives responsibly. I learned that traumatic experiences can be the wisest teachers if we are willing to learn from them. One afternoon, I watched Mara age more clearly. His skin began to show streaks of age, his pace was slower, but his eyes remained intelligent. I stood beside him, feeling a deep sense of respect and awe. I realized that life is about dealing with tension, learning from trauma, and continuing to take care of those we love, both humans and animals. I wrote in my last journal that night. This experience taught me that true courage is not about not being afraid, but about staying on the right side, in the right moment. Empathy is not just a feeling, but a consistent real action. Trauma is not always devastating. It can be a teacher that guides us to become wiser. Mara looked at me once more before stepping slowly into the forest. I smiled, feeling a peace I had never felt before. All the tension, all the fear, all the trauma I've felt since that day has formed something lasting. A relationship that neither time nor distance can destroy. I realized that Mara's story is not just a story about salvation. It was a story about life, courage, empathy, and responsibility. It was a story about how one crucial moment can shape a person forever. It was a story about me, a local boy from Florida, and an elephant that taught me the true meaning of life. When I closed my eyes that night, I could still feel the landslide, the mud holding Mara, her heavy breathing, and my own heartbeat following her rhythm. But now I know. The experience is no longer a source of fear. It is a source of strength, reminder, and inspiration to continue living with courage, empathy, and love. That I stood, watching Mara step towards the setting sun. The pace is steady, full of life and calm. I smiled, realizing that this experience was not just a story of rescue, but a story of life that shaped who I am, of courage, empathy, and connection that emerges from even the most precarious situations. Mara remained alive, safe, and wise. I keep learning from him. And I know as long as I exist, this story, a story of rescue, suspense, and courage, will live on, inspiring those who come after me to appreciate life, face fear, and find courage at the most crucial moment. I sat on a wooden bench, staring at the glistening swamp in the moonlight. The night breeze carried the scent of wet earth, and I felt such a deep calm. I realized that Mara, once almost trapped in the mud, is now a symbol of eternal life, a symbol of courage, empathy, and the realization that people and nature can coexist responsibly. And I smiled, realizing that this story is not just about Mara or me, but about all beings who have faced tension, trauma, and danger, and how we can all learn to rise up, care, and love. Mara taught me that life is not just about surviving, but about appreciating every step, every breath, and every bond we form in this world. Time goes by so fast. Mara is now clearly aging. His skin was getting wrinkled, his pace was slower, and his once mighty body was now showing signs of age. But his eyes remained smart, attentive, and as if kept memories of his whole life, including the days when the mud almost swallowed him. I stood a few meters away from him, feeling a heavy but peaceful silence. Her every breath is a reminder of the resilience and courage born of traumatic experiences. I sat on an old wooden bench, watching Mara walk slowly through the conservation trails. The young elephants follow, learning from him how to move in the swamp, how to read danger signs, and how to take care of each other. Mara remained a teacher to them, even as her body aged. I felt a pride that was hard to express, not because of human success, but because the creature I had followed since childhood had become a symbol of resilience, empathy, and wisdom. On a quiet morning, I wrote a long note in my journal, writing down the reflections I had built up over the years. I wrote about the tension I felt as a little boy when the mud held Mara back, about his heavy breathing, cracked ground, and almost unbearable panic. I wrote how one small act, a simple idea, could save a life. I write about how trauma can be a teacher, and how precarious experiences shape character and human-animal relationships. Over time, I developed a broader conservation program. We set up emergency lanes, ground sensors, and monitoring systems to avoid similar tragedies. We educate local communities, children, and visitors about the importance of preserving nature, caring for animals, and understanding the tensions and risks in their environment. I realized that courage arises not only in moments of emergency, but also in the consistency of actions. In the daily attention to other lives. One afternoon, Mara stopped by the side of the swamp and looked at me. His trunk slowly touched the ground before moving towards me, as if conveying a wordless message. I'm still here. I'm safe. And I thank you. I smiled, shed tears, and felt a bond that cannot be described in words. The trauma that used to hold him back has now turned into an enduring understanding and trust. Mara's days are getting shorter, but her quality of life remains high. I learned to respect her boundaries, give her space, and make sure that her every step was safe and quiet. I learned that true love and empathy arise when we appreciate other beings as they are, not simply what we want them to be. On Mara's last night at conservation, I sat on a wooden bench, writing long reflections about tension, about courage, about empathy, about responsibility. I wrote how that experience shaped my life, teaching me the meaning of true courage, patience, and mindfulness. I wrote that every trauma can be a teacher, and every tension can be a source of strength if we are willing to learn from it. Mara stood in front of me, looking at the night sky filled with stars. His breathing was calm, although his body was tired. I patted the ground slowly as a form of farewell. I know that Mara's time in this world is coming to an end, but the legacy she left behind, her influence on young elephants, conservation, and even on me, will be eternal. I realized that Mara's story wasn't just about an elephant being rescued from the mud. This is a story about life, courage, empathy, responsibility, and a deep human-animal relationship. I learned that a single moment can shape a person forever, and that trauma can be a reminder, a teacher, and a source of inspiration if we want to understand it. When Mara finally closed her eyes for the last time, I lowered my head. Tears flowed, but there was a deep peace. I know that he has lived a life of love, security, and care. I know that all the tensions, fears, and traumas that once held her back have now turned into a lasting legacy of life. I stood, looking at the young elephant who was following the same path, learning from Mara. I smiled, realizing that even though Mara was gone, her influence would live on in action, in learning, and in the hearts of every being she had ever touched. I know that this experience will continue to guide me, shaping me into a wiser, more empathetic human being, and aware of the responsibility towards nature and all beings in it. I wrote in my last journal. Mara taught me that true courage is not about not being afraid, but about staying on the right side, in the right moment. Empathy is not just a feeling, but a consistent real action. Trauma and tension are not always devastating. They can be teachers that guide us to become wiser, more caring, and more human. As I gazed at the night sky and the glistening swamp under the moonlight, I realized something bigger. Mara's story is a reminder that life is a series of precarious moments, teachings, and relationships. That courage, empathy, and mindfulness are born from real experiences, not theories. That trauma can be a source of strength, and a genuine connection can emerge even at the most crucial moment. I smiled, feeling a deep peace. Mara remains alive in the heart, in memory, and in every step of other beings who learn from her. And I know as long as I'm around, this story will live on, inspiring the next generation to care, be brave, and build real connections with the world around them.